to the Daoscape Arts podcast. This is part 3 of a 3-part podcast titled The Living Word, recorded at Zarah Cafe with poet and educator Nash in Beijing, China. Chris has been practicing creating Zen-inspired poetry for most of his life in the aim of integrating his audience more deeply with nature and with one another. This episode discusses the role of poetry and poets in modern society, Chris's own sense of social responsibility and how that influences his poems, the role of humour and lightheartedness in poetry, and the liberating potency of multicultural perspectives on appreciating and writing poems.
Experience poetry, live poetry, and I think, and I hope that more of that happens in China than has happened again because of this academic ivory tower approach to poetry in the UK.
Do you think also perhaps the English poetry has a kind of very strong relationship with religion as well, and maybe this move away from stuffy Victorian church values has also been a part of that?
Matthew Arnold.
Yeah, what's that?
One of the theories about what happened in the mid-Victorian period is that poetry became the new religion.
Oh.
Yeah, that as people were losing faith in Christian values, they were replacing that with a faith that poetry could give you the truth. And I think that's another dead end, because you're bringing us, you're transposing one set of values to an absolute, faith in poetry, and that takes away again spontaneity, doubt, the playfulness of the mind. It was just imposing one set of limited conditioning ideas and replacing them with another one because people wanted certainty. And the reason I mentioned Matthew Arnold is because he wrote a great poem called On Dover Beach, round about the 1880s, 1890s, where he says, "No, folks, it's not happening." And he puts us in the position of listening to the waves coming up on the shore, and he says, "You've got to accept it, everybody. It's a world of doubt and uncertainty."
Right. Okay, that's quite open-minded then. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, he was reacting against that what has then been the tradition of looking for faith and certainty within poetry.
Perhaps they could never really escape, just because English society is just so steeped in all these sayings that revolve around the religious perspective. Maybe they could never really escape that and still looked for a messiah or saviour figure or just some kind of religious motif.
Yeah, and we have to go even further and say that some poets colluded in that. Shelley was famous for saying that poets are the unseen legislators of the world. No, we're not. I'm sorry, Mr. Shelley, that's the last thing we are. We can be activators of thinking. We can be people who are catalysts and help people to think in ways that bring in their own experiences and open the door to other experiences. But the last thing poets should ever be are legislators who are saying this is the way in which the human condition should be lived. Because that absolutely closes down the individual inquiry and exploration. That is at the heart of Zen, isn't it? I mean, that's you've got to discover it for yourself. No one's going to teach it to you. You've got to have your own moment of enlightenment.
And so it sounds like you have a very strong sense of social responsibility, like you have some maybe purpose or role in this world. Where would you say you've got that from, and why do you feel that's such a strong part of what you're doing?
Very interesting, very perceptive question, because none of that is in my family at all. My family background is my father was an engineer, my 2 brothers are engineers, so from that side of my family there was nothing that talked about engagement. My family, if you like, was a bourgeois family, petit bourgeois, lower bourgeois, and they just took what they could from the world, and there was no expectation that you would get socially active or engaged at all, sort of apolitical, if you like. Why did I then start to believe that things had to be different? Partly because of reaction against that, I guess. So here's a terrible memory, but I think it's important. Sitting, watching television with my father and listening to music, which he loved, okay? He loved music, but then him making a racist comment about the singer that we were looking at. And then me just being so shocked by this and fighting back, not just accepting it, but saying, Dad, we can't, this is not the way in which we should be thinking about the world. So part of it was a reaction against it, against experiences like that. But I'd like to give a little bit of credit here to my mother, because while she was
Shout out to your mother.
Socially engaged or socially active, she became a physiotherapist for children with physical handicaps. And we actually used to have the children come to stay with us sometimes at home, and I used to go into the school. And I guess through those experiences quite early on, I started to get a sense of the damage that prejudice could do to people. And I started to hear about, we should say they're not disabled, but differently abled. And I got a sense of just what these children could do. And then, I guess that led into sort of teaching and what could I do about it. The reason why I became a teacher, I was in Italy, having quite a nice life, teaching English, no social responsibilities, not whatsoever, apart from meeting people at the bar and drinking vast amounts and eating excellent food. But that was at the time of the miners' strike. And suddenly these voices
the miners' strike in England.
Yeah. So I was in Italy having a wonderful life, but I could see that things weren't very good at all in England. A lot of social conflict, a lot of inequality, injustice. And, I kind of had a siren call that reminded me about my mum and what she'd been doing, and said, actually, Chris, just having this lovely life in Italy is not enough. You need to go back and do something. And then I went back, became a teacher, and I committed myself to working in London schools very deliberately, schools in areas of social disadvantage that actually, for me, became the most wonderful places. So one of the first places I went to work was Newham. Newham is one of the most multicultural, multiracial, multilingual communities in northeast London, and I became the community education teacher, and I just said, okay, we're going to organise workshops for local poets, community writers. Everyone came together, dissolved all the barriers. There's a heck of a lot of racism in Newham. White, very angry, bitter people about what they think has happened to their community. We were able to get them alongside people with Punjabi roots, African roots, a world, if you like, inside a room in a school, and we wrote poetry together.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think experiences like that keep reminding me that if we're going to live our lives to the full, we can't just wander off like Levi into the hermit existence. We've got to keep going, but it's difficult. You need to be sustained. You can easily lose your way, as I did as a teacher at certain times. You pursue your career, you pursue money, you pursue kudos, status. So there has to be that yin and that yang,
cohesion,
if you like, to keep yourself going as a teacher committed to this type of thing.
Would you say your poetry practice and your poems are kind of have the intention to be a kind of glue, a kind of gluing back of human spirits, or?
If you're happy to say that.
Is that your intention, or?
The shaman was always a healer, wasn't he, or she? The shaman was someone who could make people whole again by delving deep into their fragmented lives and reconnecting them with whatever made lives whole, meaningful and vital. And that's back to the Buddha, the door is always open, the poems open the door. I think we constantly can connect with that deeper, meaningful life if we are prepared to go on the journey, if we're open to the journey. And genuinely, humbly, I hope that that's what my poems do. Back to William Blake, The Doors of Perception. I just hope and pray that every one of my poems opens a little door of perception.
Right. Do you have a poem about maybe like social cohesion or something like that you could share from your book?
You're going to have to give me a couple of minutes to look at it and select the right one. I mean, all of them, in a sense, are social justice is always there, but some of them that's more heard than not. Okay, can I read you one about Martin Luther King?
Sure, whatever you feel. Yeah.
Okay. Are we ready to go?
We're ready. Yeah.
So the poem is called "I May Not Get There," and these are the words that Martin Luther King used in a speech just before he was assassinated. The speech is called "I've Been to the Mountaintop," and he spoke to a shocked, bewildered, confused group of African Americans who'd been with him on this crusade, and he gave them these incredible words, which were, "I may not get there." Okay? But he said, "You can." And the phrase that he shared with them, which I think is pure Buddhism, pure Zen, a dangerous unselfishness. So he said, if you are prepared to lead lives of dangerous unselfishness, to give yourself to this, then we will get there. And so I wanted to echo some of that. I will warn the listeners that there is a little bit of satire in this poem, so please don't be shocked about the satire. So, I may not get there, a dangerous unselfishness. Darkness on the bloody pass, from the here into the now. The stars struggling to shine. A salesman out-trumps Jesus as he tells us there are none. Out of dark dungeons of injustice, a caravan of ragged refugees, Caravaggio up the bloody pass. Christened by the conquistadors under a helicopter's surveillance, oh, believe in a better day at last. One back from a mountaintop fell as from a bullet's betrayal, urging us on. I may not be there, that Baptist voice asking still, who is really your neighbour? Fox News was so gospel clear. The brother in the studio limo did not pass on the other side, but auditioned him for Duality TV, a show, Death and the Negro Egro, recording and remixing the vision till it hit media-friendly versions, now fit for the burbs to be buying. Fox News gave the gospel truth. The Donald did not pass by. More fake news, media lies. It was the healthcare killed him. If the Prince of Peace had had a gun, such a horrible, horrible man. But he voted Trump as he choked. Only liberals whine for pure proof. A letter cut Harlem in his chest. Sisters rushed in to recover. The driver so deft in his speed, many arms whirling on a wheel that he might live with us still. The driven poverty of his heart, the driven poverty of his spirit, the power of the poor together. Segregated in the Samaritan night. Later, a note hidden in his sleeve. Please, Mr. King, try not to sneeze. P.S. For what it's worth, I am white. So it's about the last days of Martin Luther King. And shortly before the final assassination, there was another attempt on his life. And he was rushed into hospital. and he was saved by a white nurse who said to him, absolutely truthfully, don't sneeze, because if you sneeze, you're going to rupture that major artery.
Right.
And so that last little bit, please, Mr. King, try not to sneeze. P.S. for what it's worth, I am white, is historically the note that was left by his bedside.
Really?
Yeah.
P.S. I am white. Just wrote that. Wow.
Yeah. I don't think I need to say anything.
Yeah.
I think it speaks for itself. Yeah. Also, in there is a Buddhist reference. The driver so deft in his speed, many arms whirling on a wheel that he might live with us still, is Guan Yin, the bodhisattva of mercy, who I see driving the car through the streets of Harlem to keep Martin Luther King alive at this important moment.
Right.
And if he'd have died that night, of course he never would have made the most famous speech that he made in Washington,
Right.
I Have a Dream, where I believe that he was a shaman or a healer who reached out through all of the rubbish that surrounded him in the world to give a vision of healing to a whole country. Unfortunately, of course, they've now turned their back on that, and that's why we've got the references to Mr. Trump and a rather different way of seeing the world.
So there was quite a bit of starkness in that poem. I could feel a bit of tension growing in me as you were going through. I thought, oh no, is this going to just amplify some kind of maybe some empty, stark feeling that comes through from the media? Do you what do you think about the role of humour in poetry? And do you use that yourself? Or?
Not as much as I wish I could. I wish I was much funnier and wittier than I am. Of course, famously, the Koan are funny. They're jokes. If you see the Buddha on the road, kill him. On one level, it's hilarious. On another level, it's utterly serious. And so I'd love to be able to open minds, because that's what humour does. It opens our minds. It breaks down barriers of resistance in thinking, and in that spontaneity of laughter, it can happen. And so, yes, it's something that I'm aware of, and I study, if you like, to try to develop a greater sense of humour in myself. And I'm aware that I am driven by anger. Part of the price of trying to be socially committed is that you're driven by anger, a sense of outrage. That Donald Trump can be there doing this stuff, saying this stuff, damaging people's lives in this kind of way. And yes, the tension is the anger.
Right, sure.
But I don't want to rant. I don't like ranting. And ranting is purposeless. It's egoistical. It becomes a kind of replacement populism. Look at me, I'm ranting about this. And that's not poetry, it's not opening minds. And so the balance is looking for that lighter touch, that humour, which is why in the end of this poem you've got the quite comic idea of the driver who's sort of flashing them through the streets of Harlem, and that little note at the end, P.S. I'm white. This is not without humour, but hopefully it's a very touching humour that goes to the heart of what we're trying to say here. I wish I was a great comic writer, but I know I'm never going to be.
I think everybody has their healing arts, don't they? And as you said, you taking on this kind of shamanic channel, using metaphor to help people heal or helps communities to heal. You have to use whatever tools you have.
But you have to. Right? You absolutely have to say, I'm not going to let my ego grow in this direction. The temptation of being the shaman is that ego grows. And I think there's a very real example of that in Ted Hughes. Back to him, that unfortunately that dark ego overtook him, and we know the unfortunate stories of the deaths of the two women who were in his lives. I think he lost control of that.
Right.
And it's. In his last publication, one of the last ones, was Birthday Letters, and I think what people are touched by is the humbleness that he recovered in his life, after the sort of monstrous ego that some of the things that were happening in maybe the 60s or 70s. And I'm certainly aware that bits of me are tempted by that. You know, when I was in the sixth form, I wanted to be a fascist. You know, there was a time at which I saw myself as this, thumping leader who was going to lead everybody to the promised land.
Fascist, not in the Nazi sense.
No. Fascist
in a kind of rigid,
heroic program, heroic leader. But there is something in that, isn't there, about the leader who's got a vision and wants to take people in the direction of that vision. But of course, the problem. Fascism is the opposite of this, because it's about imposing rather than people coming to and discovering. And so hopefully, I sort of rode back from that towards a sort of a guide idea that Confucius. Right. When I walk with many, one of them will be my teacher. I just hope that I among the many, I'm a teacher.
Sure. Do you think it's possible for poetry to be light-hearted and yet still make an impact, a heavy impact?
Absolutely. There's a wonderful poem by Brecht where he talks about learning to drive, and he describes a number of different teachers who were teaching him to drive, and he talks about the fact that those people who were serious and they just sort of made it into such a special art and a skill left him with no effect whatsoever. He couldn't learn from them. And then he talks about this mad lunatic who was his ultimate driver, who used to sort of puff on a cigar when he was teaching Brecht how to drive. And he says that's the moment when I actually learned how to be a driver, because all of my anxiety and stress just disappeared, and I could relax and learn to drive. And
go with the flow kind of thing.
Absolutely, it's Tao, isn't it? It's pure Tao. It's getting away from all the barriers that disconnect us from who we can be and enable. And that's from my experience of teaching as well. So if I did have a skill as a comedian, it was in the classroom, and I always try to make my lessons as entertaining as possible, because when children come into classrooms and it's literature, there is a barrier. There is an expectation that this is going to be difficult, that you're going to be doing something that is beyond what you can do.
Stuffy and lofty.
Exactly. And so therefore humour is a way of just breaking all of that down and just enjoying the process of engaging with poetry. But that's very often frowned on. I can remember having a lesson where I turned Of Mice and Men into a reality TV show with sort of a Jeremy Kyle type thing. And an inspector came into the classroom and said, "What the hell are you doing?"
In the UK?
What do you think you're doing? This is not how we teach poetry. I want silence. I want people bent over books. I want them, remembering these great lines of literature. I was just trying to make it meaningful and to, give the children an appreciation that they could take this literature and make it for themselves and enjoy that process. But that's often not what the po-faced inspectorate wants.
Do you think the equivalent inspectors here in China would also have the same attitude? I'm guessing they probably would. Or?
I've got absolutely no idea. I just couldn't comment on that at all, except to say that we're doing quite an interesting piece of work in my school right now. And my school, the majority of teachers are Chinese domestic teachers, and we're looking at standards for teaching, what it means to be a good teacher. And we get a set of standards from the UK, from Cambridge Assessment International Education.
So your school has this kind of have an overseeing board or some?
No, they have me.
Oh, right, okay.
I am the standards, if you like.
Okay.
But back to that. So what we're now doing is fusing together the English standards and the Chinese standards, and we're finding a lot of overlap. Right. And actually, there are bits of quite progressive thinking in both sets of standards that give me some hope that there are safe spaces where thinking can be developed. So I'd like to think that some of the reductive practices that are in the UK are actually not prevalent within the area of international education. There's a bit more space for innovation.
Is it because it straddles two cultures and therefore you've got some more to...
I think so. I genuinely believe that bilingualism, multiculturalism has got that liberating possibility because you can't see things from one point of view. You just by being in that classroom, you've got to be able to appreciate and understand that there is more than one interpretation of what's going on.
Right.
Whereas within England, unfortunately, at the moment, we're driven by not just by one interpretation, but by a blinking examiner's interpretation, or even worse, a few years ago, by Michael Gove's interpretation. So the Minister of Education is actually telling us this is what a poem means, everybody. Well, I'm sorry, Michael, that's not how poetry and poetry education should be.
This is the end of podcast 4, part 3, The Living Word, with Chris Nash, the last part of this series.